Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us from all over the world, from different time zones. I'm really excited to be here and hear about everyone's contributions and having a great discussion about police brutality against persons with disability across the world and during the pandemic, which is going to be the focus of this first webinar. My name is Bruno Montero, and I'll be one of the moderators of this webinar alongside my colleague, William Maseka. And this webinar is organized by Validity Foundation. Before I give the floor to my colleague, William, and our great panelists, I'm just quickly going to provide an overview of this webinar's housekeeping rules, and then explain why we're here and how this webinar is going to be structured. As for the usual webinar housekeeping rules, please bear with me on this. First and foremost, I need to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded. I hope everyone is comfortable with this. And then whenever you're not speaking, please do keep yourselves muted. Whenever you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand option first. If you're not familiar with that feature, I invite you to look at the center of the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see a button that says raise hand. And then when you press it, then us moderators will be able to see the raise hand option. Basically, whenever you press the button, just give some time and then allow me or William to call out your name and to give you your turn to speak. If you're a participant, we will unmute you to allow you to speak whenever we call your name. So we just ask for your patience whenever you'd like to participate. Participants will also have the option to use the chat box to ask questions, especially during the question and answer period of this webinar. Then as a last note, we want to make this webinar as accessible as possible and give everyone here the possibility to participate. If there's any concern or you need assistance from the organizers during this webinar, please contact either me, Bruno, or Sophia directly using the chat box. And we will try to assist you to the extent possible. Finally, while we hope this doesn't happen, of course, we do ask for your patience if there are any technical difficulties. We will give you instructions to help overcome this whenever happens. So now with this out of the way, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the webinar and why we're here. So as you know, this webinar is the first of a webinar series, which is centered on tackling torture against persons with disabilities in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The webinar series comprises of 6 webinars, which will be held weekly. If you haven't registered and you'd like to participate for the other webinars, we encourage you to do so by accessing the link, which I'll copy to the chat box here, which you might be already familiar. Now, hope you can access this web link, but in any case, you can access the register if you access the Validity Foundation's webpage and press the projects tab, and then you'll find the webinar series instructions on how to register. Just to finalize and just give the floor to William, in this webinar, we'll have the opportunity to discuss alongside every one of you the problem of torture against persons with disabilities by police during the pandemic and possible solutions and remedies to address it. So during the first part, we'll basically have a conversation with our panelists on different aspects relating to torture against persons with disability by police around the world. And then after this first part, this will follow for a Q&A session where we'll give plenty of opportunity for participants to ask questions to panelists, and then we'll engage and have a broader conversation to the extent possible. We're really very keen and happy to hear everyone's thoughts on the matter, and we'll have some questions ready for all of you also. We look forward to a great discussion, and without much ado, I'll just give the floor to my colleague, William. Please go ahead.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from whatever part of the world that you're joining us. We really hope that you are going to enjoy this series for this specific webinar. Our intention is to tackle how people with disabilities have experienced violence, which might lead to torture or ill treatment or punishment during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, we have a very well-able panelists here. We have people from Nigeria, we have speakers from Indonesia, we have speakers from the US, we have speakers from Uganda. So the idea here is to have a conversation. Now, some of my panelists wanted to present something, but I think we thought because we wanted it to be much more of a conversation, so that even you as a participant, you're not left behind in terms of those, what I usually call boring lecture hall theater classes. So we don't want to do that. So our intention here is just to have a conversation as to how police brutality has led to violence or has led to people with disabilities experiencing torture. Now, why is this particular webinar important? The reason why it's important is for different reasons. That majority of the time, people with disabilities experience violence, and one is either not reported, or whatever it is that is reported is not reported accurately. So we need to have this conversation, and I'm sure during this coronavirus pandemic, majority of our countries in different parts of the world were able to have lockdowns. And with these lockdowns, most of the times, and I'll give an example of maybe some countries in Africa, whereby we had opportunities where we were being told that now it's the police who are going to ensure that lockdowns are effected well. What does that mean for people with disabilities? What does it mean? During this coronavirus pandemic, Validity Foundation with 6 other organizations conducted what was called the Disability Rights Monitor. And one of the things in which we were able to gather during this monitor was that there was an absolute violence which was effected on people with disabilities. So we thought it was important for us to have this conversation and to discuss as to why this violence, number one, why do people with disabilities are affected differently or disappropriately against people without disabilities as compared to people without disabilities. And number two, what are some of the things in which we need to do so that we can have this conversation in terms of, what is it called? Ensuring that we are able to address this issue. And more importantly is that we are going to make, we hope we are going to make the connection between Article 1 of the United Conventions Against Torture, which defines what torture and treatment is all about, and how people with disabilities fall within that category. And I have a very able panelist to help me do this work. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, to tell us their name, their organization, and maybe something interesting about them. Yes, something interesting about them. Yes, so I'll probably start with Melanie, who you are the nearest to my screen. So probably you can introduce yourself, yes. And the organization that you work with.
Thank you, William. I just want to thank the Validity team for highlighting the abuse, violence, and exploitation that persons with disabilities can experience when they encounter security forces, particularly during COVID. So as William said, my name is Melanie Kawano-Chiu. I'm the Evaluation and Learning Manager at the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. I'm actually based in Los Angeles, California, on the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva people. Yesterday here in the United States, there's a former federal holiday that was called Columbus Day or Discoverers Day or Indigenous Persons Day, basically marking when Europeans came over to the United States. So I have a 7-year-old daughter that is learning virtually from home in the other room. And it's lovely to be here with you all.
Okay. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that introduction. And next, I will go to David. David.
Thank you so much, William. My name is David Kabanda. I'm a Ugandan. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Food and Adequate Living Rights. We have done many cases concerning persons with disabilities, and specifically looking at how law can be used to prevent violation of rights of children living with autism. We have done too many cases in courts of law, but during COVID-19, we have also witnessed many persons living with HIV go through inhuman and degrading treatment and actually torture at hands of the security agencies, local defense units, and also police. This webinar is very relevant and timely to have these discussions and how we can use the law to prevent these inhuman and degrading treatment actions that are meted to persons living with disabilities. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. Kassim. You're muted, Kassim. Yes, unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes,
Perfect.
we can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everywhere across Nigeria, across the world. My name is Kassim Lawal. I am the chairman of Association of Lawyers with Disabilities in Nigeria, FCT chapter, and the public relations officer of the Nigeria Association of the Blind, FCT chapter. In the past year, we carried out projects on one on accessibility of public buildings. That was the one that was executed by Nigeria Association of the Blind, sponsored by DRF, and the other project has to do with access to justice administration system in Nigeria. And that was the one that was executed by Association of Lawyers with Disabilities in Nigeria, also sponsored by DRF. So with these projects, we've made a lot of inroads, especially with accessibility of lawyers with disability and their clients with one form of disabilities or the other to be able to access justice in terms of going to court, making the sitting arrangement convenient and comfortable for both lawyers and their clients. So that's how far we have gone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kassim. At this particular time, I'll ask Purwanti to introduce herself.
Terima kasih. Nama saya Purwanti. Saya dari Sigap Indonesia. Saya sebagai koordinator advokasi dan jaringan di lembaga Sigap. Dan saya sebagai pendamping untuk difabel berhadapan dengan hukum dan sebagai advokasi untuk reformasi hukum yang fair bagi penyandang disabilitas yang berhadapan dengan hukum.
Okay, the interpretation.
Okay, so she's Purwanti from Sigap Indonesia, and she's as companion for disability which has conflict with the law. That's all.
Thank you. So at this particular time, I want to go straight into the conversation. And what I'm going to do is that we are going to have this conversation in form of, what is this called? In form of question. So what I'm going to begin with is probably my first question will be to Mr. David Kabanda, okay? So we are having this conversation about people with disabilities experiencing violence. Now, let's start with the very basic understanding of, you talked about degrading treatment, inhumane. What do we mean? And do people with disabilities experience this kind of degrading treatment? Does it fall within the category of Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture? You're muted.
Thank you so much, William. When it comes to torture, inhuman, degrading treatment, many countries have different laws, but when we specifically look at the Convention Against Torture, under Article 1, you realize that for you to be able to understand it very well, you always have to start with the preamble to the convention, which takes us back to the UN Charter, observance of human rights, then Article 5 of the UDHR, and then Article 7 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights of People. So when you look at specifically Article 1, if anything is severe pain or suffering, that is whether physical or mental, and is inflicted intentionally on a person for purposes of obtaining from him or a third person information or confession, or punishing him or her for that act of a third person who has committed such an act, or is suspected of having committed such an act, and that pain is inflicted on such a person, that is defined as torture according to the Convention Against Torture. But the infliction must have been carried out by a person in official capacity, or by a person who has been directed by that person in the official capacity. That is specifically according to CAT. And when you look at CAT, there is a distinction between what is torture and then what is inhuman and degrading treatment. Although the discussion around the two is becoming very thin every time. So for you to be able to understand torture in the Convention Against Torture, you need to understand torture as not only an act in itself or a specific type of act, but it is a legal qualification of an event or behavior based on a comprehensive assessment in most cases of that event or behavior. And for us to be able to understand, we need to look at the elements, because at international level, this is the definition we have in as far as the CAT is concerned. So the elements can be looked at from 4 dimensions. The first one is the nature of the act. The legal definition of torture, then when you look at the nature of the act, will encompass both acts and omissions that inflict severe pain or suffering. Severe is something that will be subjected to every judicial officer looking at how given kind of act or omission was carried out. The term act, which is mentioned in Article 1, must not be given a narrow interpretation. That act, I can refer you to one of those early cases in Greece that defined and considered deprivation of food and other items to constitute an act of torture. Pain and suffering may be either physical or mental, and a threat to torture or mock execution can be also comprised within the concept of mental suffering. Now, the case that I have referred to above is the Denmark versus Greece communication 3321-67 European Court of Human Rights. They concluded that if people have been deprived of food, that can be an act of torture. So the second element that is in Article 1, when they are looking at torture, is the intention of the perpetrator. Pain and suffering must be intentionally inflicted to the victim in order to qualify as torture. Meaning that when you look at examples, you cannot pick on negligence and conclude that that is torture or someone intended. But in some circumstances, recklessness can be concluded to be or to import intention. So when you look in the assessment of whether there was torture, one of the second element apart from the acts is the intention, because the Article 1 is talking about intention. So for you in determining intention, it is also expansive. Now the third element is the purpose, because when you read Article 1, it imports in the element of purpose. So in defining and also looking at torture under Article 1, the different purposes that an act of ill treatment must fulfill to be considered as torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment are the following. You may be, maybe the perpetrator is intending to extract confession, and that confession, according to the convention, cannot be accepted anywhere or in the courts of law. Or obtaining for the victim or a third person information, or it can be, the purpose could be punishment, the purpose could be intimidation and coercion, the purpose could be discrimination. When we come back to our discussion today, when we look at COVID-19 and torture to persons having disabilities, you realize that many of these acts were done because the security officers wanted to intimidate them or for purposes of discriminating them. In many countries, including Uganda, where I speak from now, there are many COVID-19 committees were constituted with complete disregard of persons living with disabilities. This has resulted even in some of them being killed. So the fourth element that we need to look at when we are carving out torture, as it is used in CAT, is the involvement of public officials and all people in positions of authority. So the question of involvement of public official is usually straightforward, because you could see that this is a police officer, this is an army officer. The recognition, though, of other people acting in an official capacity may be more problematic. Similarly, while it is easy to consider that ill treatment inflicted at the instigation of a public official is torture, such act inflicted with the consent or acquiescence of the same public official is also a delicate issue. So in determining, of course, courts or tribunals, committees will look at the circumstances surrounding the acts or omissions, and then they will determine whether this one was working in official capacity or whoever did it was had consent from the person who had official capacity. So, but I want to tell colleagues and the participants in this webinar that I'm limiting my definition in CAT, Convention Against Torture, in other jurisdictions, you find that countries have expanded this definition just beyond officers or officials, or only or having a distinction between torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And for us to appreciate this is you also have to read, like, for example, Article 10, which requires all state parties to train their law enforcement officers in this right, such that they know that a right should be protected. I think for now I can stop here. When you look at specifically Article 1 of CAT, it limits and those the different elements and how they look at torture. Thank you, William.
Thank you so much, David, for that particular well thought out introduction. So my next question will probably go to Kassim. So David has talked about the idea that the definition of convention, again, the definition of torture, or he limited his conversation within Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture, or popularly called CAT. My question to you will be, has your country been able, for instance, to limit the definition or expand the definition of torture within Nigeria? And more importantly, how has that been received, especially within the disability rights community, which or within the Association of Lawyers with Disabilities in Nigeria? So I think just try and help us understand whether that definition within CAT that David has explained is narrow or wide in Nigeria. Just unmute yourself again.
Yeah, unfortunately, we cannot do it on our end.
Hello. Could you please come again with the question? I didn't get you clearly.
So the question is this, that David has talked about the definition which has different elements. For instance, the nature of the act, intention, purpose, and public official. But the definition, as in some jurisdiction, has been found to be quite narrow or quite wide. So I just want you to explain to us what is your experience or what is the definition of torture within Nigeria and what it is that is applicable in relation to the Article 1 of the Convention.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. With respect to Nigeria, the definition of torture has been expanded given the line of decision that have been turned out in our courts. In most cases, any sort of pain inflicted on an individual, especially persons with disabilities, whether that person is in a position of authority or not, or for whatever purpose or intention, such conduct amounts to torture. So our courts have been able to expatiate and expand the limit of definition as contained in CAT. So that is it for Nigeria. There's no specific law that actually goes to expand, but in most cases, what we have different laws. For instance, Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, which also defines torture in line with CAT, but due to judicial activism, the definition has been expanded. In respect of our experience in Nigeria, sometime in April, precisely on the 19th of April, 2020, during the lockdown in Nigeria, many of our people were badly affected, much more affected than other persons without disabilities. They were more affected in the sense that many of them are dependents. They are unemployed, so they rely on their relatives for feeding, for clothing, and whatsoever. And as a result of the pandemic, many of them were laid off. I mean, those that they depended on were laid off. Many of them work for private establishments. So due to the effect of COVID, some of them were laid off, some of them had their salaries slashed, and some of them who were entrepreneurs could not really do business as a result of the lockdown. So persons with disabilities were much more affected. So in looking at the difficulties our members face, both our members and other persons with disabilities that are not our members. So we put together a kind of measure, palliatives, wherein public-spirited Nigerians came together to, donate food items and other forms of things that could be useful to persons with disabilities. So as a leader in my community, one of the satellite areas in the FCT, I was mandated to distribute some of these items. And in the course of the assignment, I had my niece of about 15 years. So we hired two motorcyclists to convey us from one point to another. So in the course of doing my duty, I was attacked from behind by a group of men. Initially, I thought they were more, but on being told that they were policemen, I was in a state of shock. And immediately they approached me. They just dragged me down from the bike and started hitting me. What are you doing here? Wait, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm a blind man. I came to distribute some food items to my members. And one of them said, no, blind man does not walk. And they kept hitting me left, right, and center until I was left in the pool of my blood. Perhaps when they saw the blood gushing out of my face, they abandoned me there and ran away. Unfortunately, my niece that was with me then, perhaps due to fear, also ran away. So in trying to, take care of my blood and everything, we quickly rushed to the hospital. And in the hospital, we were asked to go get a police report. So immediately we went to the nearest police station to lodge a complaint. And afterwards, we returned to the hospital where I was treated. Unfortunately, the divisional police officer in charge of that area actually denied that those people that carried out the acts were not policemen. And fortunately, my niece, although she was some meters away from that scene of the incident, saw the insignia of police on the vehicle. There was also one other man that was in front of his own apartment that actually saw these people. But in the course of the investigation, the police refused to take the testimony of my niece. And the other man that actually witnessed it, initially he was willing to give statement, but at a point, he withdrew. And I cannot explain why he withdrew. All efforts to ensure that he comes around to, give a statement fell on deaf ears. Even as at the time, the Association of Lawyer Disabilities made a case that the matter be transferred from that police station to the state CID. We encountered the same challenge. And the challenge was, who were these people? I cannot see them. The two witnesses, my niece, was not called. The other witness was not willing to come around to testify. So, and another challenge was that the policemen were asking me to mobilize them to the scene of the incident. I said, well, it is the duty of the police to carry out investigation. And one of them told me, see, we don't have fuel in our cars. And if you cannot come and convey us, then they are afraid my case might die there. And truly speaking, nothing has been achieved since then. Now, there was an operational guideline that was issued in the course of the lockdown. It was actually issued in May, and the incident I encountered happened in April. In law,
so
that
Kassim,
operational guideline.
before you go, Kassim, just hold on. Before you go, I'm sorry to have to cut you. Before you go into all that, so what we intend to do is to move step by step. Okay. So you will come back to that particular point in a minute. Okay. So I think we have understood up to that, and I think I've noted the idea about the operational guidelines. But okay, my next question will be to Melanie. You have had this conversation about police brutality. So so let's try and understand. Well, first of all, when we talk about police brutality, what do we mean by police brutality?
Thank you, William, and Kassim, thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry that you had to experience that and that your niece was with you. I didn't realize that as well. So I think there are a couple of points that I wanted to touch on as we think about police brutality. And first, I want to say that I'm here as an ally and not as an expert or an experiencer of police brutality. What I share, I've learned from activists, from persons that have responded to the COVID DRM survey, from our grantees, and scholars around the US. And I'm happy to share later just some resources that in particular around the United States conversation around police brutality and persons with disability and the very active community there are of activists here in the States. Police brutality, the general definition is that it is acts against people by security forces, right? The term tends to infer and refer to physical harm and excess use of force. This can include beatings, racial abuse, unlawful killings. We've touched on the piece of torture, and even aggression toward peaceful protesters, which we've seen quite a bit around the world, not just in this COVID context, but prior as well. And the use of unlawful force really results in people being deprived of their right to life. It violates the right to be free from discrimination, and the right to liberty and security, and the right to equal protection under the law. And to this general definition, I probably would just add two things. First, police brutality is the result of ableist paradigms, right? So an ableist paradigm in a police context says that the person that the police are engaging with has to respond in a certain rigid way. Right? A police officer may, if you're actually given a chance, maybe I think in Kassim's case, there wasn't an opportunity to respond, but police often expect a very instant and rigid and verbal and physical response to when they're engaging with people to de-escalate a situation. This, however, is based on an assumption that the person the police is engaging with will respond instantly, can respond instantly, has heard the police's calls, understands what the situation is happening, and understands the situation that they find themselves in. And this does not take into consideration varying individual differences, right? And force is then used by security forces when the response is not ideal. And instead of de-escalating a situation, it often escalates a situation. And so we can imagine someone with a psychosocial disability who might then anxiety and panic might ensue, or there might be someone with a developmental disability and have a conversation needs to be de-escalated before communication can really be clear between the individual and the security person, the police force. I think for me, police brutality is particularly painful in its contradiction, right? Police are supposed to be protectors, and they should not be the ones that are harming those that they are supposed to protect. All citizens, all persons equally. And when police brutality happens, there should be a just response. There should be an investigation. That individual or even individuals or a whole system should be held accountable for what happened. As we're sort of talking about in Kassim's case, his example shows that when justice is not served, when there is not an in-depth inquiry, what ends up happening is that violence is then perpetuated throughout the system. And there is then systemic violence against people when they are not able to receive and access justice for what has happened to them. I would say that this extension of violence throughout systems harms not just persons that have been victims of police brutality, but I would say it harms society and whole communities who are looking for justice themselves. And that even within security forces, that violence can be directed inward, where there is intimidation toward other police officers to make sure that there is silence and a culture of impunity and a culture of protecting themselves. The Los Angeles Times just came out with some data yesterday showing that over the last 5 years, there have only been 2 official reports of police officers reporting other police officers for excessive use of force. And this is in contradiction to the thousands of community complaints of excessive use of force by the Los Angeles Police Department. So there's something there about police brutality that affects, again, one individual and then filters down through an entire system that upholds ableist perspectives and that perpetuates impunity around violence that is inflicted upon citizens.
Sure. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that. And my next question would be to Purwanti. So Melanie has talked about the idea of police being protectors and not the people who violate the rights of people with disabilities. So my question to you, are police protectors in Indonesia, or they perpetuate violence against people with disabilities in Indonesia?
Ya, terima kasih. Saya akan sampaikan bagaimana kondisi di Indonesia terkait dengan akses to justice for people with disabilities. Nah, yang kami lakukan terkait dengan proses peradilan untuk penyandang disabilitas berhadapan dengan hukum, kami setidaknya ada 7 poin untuk implementasi peradilan inklusi. Yang pertama, vokal poin difabel berhadapan dengan hukum. Kita mendorong agar organisasi-organisasi difabel di Indonesia menjadi lumbung informasi dan pintu pertama untuk melakukan advokasi hukum, begitu. Yang kedua, advokasi penanganan kasus-kasus penyandang disabilitas yang berhadapan dengan hukum, baik itu litigasi maupun non-litigasinya.
In this pandemic situation, that we are trying to advocate people from police and also from around the environment. That the first thing is that we want to give a strategic model for all of the people, so that, for example, in this pandemic era, that we all lost our job, and we are focusing on the disability people. Like, for the first thing is that we approach them and we want to encourage them to give them a proper treatment for the disability itself.
That in Indonesia, the disabilitas organization will be the place for learning about the law and information of disabilities. Lanjut Mbak Purwanti.
Ya, yang kedua, advokasi, litigasi, dan litigasi untuk kasus-kasus penyandang disabilitas berhadapan dengan hukum.
Okay, so the next is that we want to advocate people disability to more close with the law. Lanjut.
Advocate to case.
Okay, so the next is that we want to policy advocacy from local level to national level.
Ya.
Next one. The next is the development of law enforcement officers with the disability. Lanjut, Mbak.
Polis, kejaksaan, hakim,
The law officers include police, prosecutors, and judge.
ya. Kemudian mengorganisir jaringan stakeholder strategis untuk advokasi baik kebijakan maupun penanganan kasus.
Organizing stakeholders from the policy to case handlers.
Ya. Kemudian pada advokasi, aksesibilitas, dan reasonable akomodasi untuk penanganan kasus-kasus disabilitas yang berhadapan dengan hukum.
And the next is the accessibility advocacy, which facing with the law.
Baik infrastrukturnya, infrastruktur bangunan untuk kepolisian, pengadilan, kejaksaan, sampai pada pengadaan sarana-prasarana yang aksesibel untuk proses-proses hukum bagi penyandang disabilitas.
For building infrastructure from the police courts to make it accessible to everyone.
Kemudian kita mengembangkan riset dan produksi referensi tentang difabel berhadapan dengan hukum. Penelitian tentang putusan-putusan kasus difabel berhadapan dengan hukum, penelitian tentang kapasitas hukum bagi difabel dalam konteks hukum pidana maupun perdata, penelitian tentang penanganan kasus, kemudian memproduksi modul untuk training bagi aparat penegak hukum, bagi hakim, bagi petugas layanan.
The point of the material is that we want to build the cooperations with the police and the prosecutors to have a system for handling disabilities. For example, like we also had at the UNCRPD, there are rights of persons with disability, human rights law, Convention on Children's Rights, especially those which related to justice.
Sorry, come again with your question.
So how often does police brutality happen against people with disabilities? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is how are these cases addressed within the judicial system? And are the perpetrators, let's assume, police held accountable, or it just what I usually call, it has a magic disappearance within the criminal justice system?
Thank you very much. The issue of police brutality against persons with disabilities is rampant. Even before the outbreak of coronavirus, we've had so many cases of brutality of police against persons with disabilities. During the lockdown, it's increased. Unfortunately, we've not been able to bring anybody to justice. I mean, the perpetrators. although in the course of the lockdown, the federal government, through the Inspector General of Police, issued an operational guideline to guide and guard the conduct of men and officers of the Nigerian police force. Unfortunately, the provisions therein are obeyed in breach. Although the incident that happened to me actually happened before the issuance of the operational guideline, but notwithstanding, in spite of our complaints and all that, the authority has not really acted. Like for my own story, the IPO and other members of his team were asking me to, to mobilize, and it shouldn't be so. It shouldn't be so. And another challenge with respect to prosecuting erring officers is that for somebody with visual impairment or blind that cannot, see his immediate environment, how does he or she get information that will help to, first of all, identify the perpetrators, and two, have enough evidence to be able to establish any act of torture or inhuman treatment against such a person. So the challenge is, as Melanie said, policemen trying to, cover up for themselves, and two, the challenge of evidence. So those are the issues that we are currently facing. And with respect to access to justice, I mentioned earlier that Association of Lawyers with Disabilities in Nigeria executed a project in respect of justice administration system, access to justice administration system for persons with disabilities. And as a result of that, some of the practice directions for lawyers, and as well as adjustment of certain structures within the court premises have been effected. For instance, in the FCT, Abuja, where I'm resident, the FCT High Court there has its own practice direction that ensures that a visually impaired legal practitioner is aided even within the bar. For instance, the convention is that only lawyers can sit in the bar, but with that directive, some of us are able to get our aid in there to help us with one thing or the other. And also the use of public address system is now mandatory, so that those of us that are visually impaired can be able to, get whatever the judge is saying or whoever is addressing the court. And steps are also being made in the National Industrial Court for adjustment of entrances to the courts, to the courtrooms. The courts have been practically inaccessible in the past, but with our advocacy, some of these things have been addressed. The only thing is just the attitude of some of our colleagues. I mean, lawyers that are not living with disabilities. They are still, far from recognizing the fact that these are people that should be appreciated. But we thank the Nigerian Bar Association, the umbrella body of legal practitioners in Nigeria, the incumbent, Mr. Olumide Akwata, started well. Recently invited us for a panel where we discussed our challenges and all that. And then in the spirit of that, he constituted a committee where we were asked to bring in, provisions that could be imputed into, for instance, the Nigerian Bar Constitution, the Legal Practitioners Act, and some other laws that we feel need amendments in one way or the other. So we are in the process of doing that. And I want to believe that by the time we complete our task, justice administration system will be more accessible to persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Melanie, so just trying to explain to us also, what are some of the specific things that you found out from the monitor, that the kind of police brutality people with disabilities experienced from the monitor when you are basically interrogating all this issue?
Thanks, William. That's a really good question. So in the midst of the COVID context, I think what happened to Kassim is actually, unfortunately, a perfect example of what many persons with disabilities are experiencing within COVID. So the COVID Disability Rights Monitor survey had received more than 2,100 responses from 124 countries around the world. And of those responses, nearly 300 mentioned penalties or punishment for breaking COVID state emergency rules. And many of them dealt with police interactions in the midst of that. And this happened, we received reports from persons in the Philippines, in Kenya, in France, in Serbia, in the United Kingdom. So there has been a wide range of where we have seen police brutality happening. You know, some people might think that police brutality might happen in a state where there are stronger security forces or more rigid governmental structures. But what we've seen with the data with the COVID DRM is that it's been across the board an experience of persons with disabilities, and it often is this layering effect. And so when information may not be accessible, so if there are not sufficient sign language interpreters, different types of easy to read information about what the lockdown entails, and if people are not also given sufficient advance notice, right? So there's that one aspect of inaccessible information. It needs to be in every single language. One of our DRF grantees in Ghana did a jingle in 6 different regional languages, sort of just within their district, to make sure that everyone knew how persons with disabilities needed to make extra considerations in the midst of COVID when that information wasn't getting to them through government communications. So you have this aspect of inaccessible information. And I think Kassim and David and Purwanti have talked about economic implications of the lockdown and how that has affected persons with disabilities. Whether that means there have been inflation costs with basic essentials such as food and medication, or just a lack of access in general, of not being able to leave your home without encountering a security force who is trying to then make sure that everyone stays at home, but may not. Again, this question this goes back, I think, to a little bit of what David was talking about, intentionality. There may not be intention to harm persons with disabilities, but there has certainly not been an intention to make sure that police forces are then trained in the midst of enforcing COVID lockdowns to think about how they engage with persons with disabilities. So I think the challenge has been that in some of the most extreme cases, more than excessive use of force has been used. An Army veteran, for instance, Winston Ragos, with post-traumatic disorder, was shot and killed in the Philippines. In Kenya, police forces had killed a man with a physical disability for not wearing masks. And the resulting community outcry, the news reports in Kenya noted that at that point, more than 200 people in the year, and that was just in June, had been killed by Kenyan police forces just in 2020. So your earlier question about how prevalent sort of violence and police brutality is against the general population, I think we can see that it is an ongoing challenge and an ongoing problem in many places of the world. And the COVID lockdown hasn't made the situation any easier, or unfortunately allowed space for people to respond in a better and more inclusive manner.
Thank you. So David, probably the question will also be, what are your experiences of people with disabilities in Uganda, and what are some of the challenges that you've been able to for this particular conversation?
Thank you, William. Our experiences have been a little bit nasty, I should say. I have listened to our colleague Kassim, and I'm like, oh, things are happening the same way all over. So we have witnessed police brutality against persons having disabilities in Uganda, and in one of the cases, actually, the gentleman was killed. He was beaten because the police were giving him, I think, instructions, and he couldn't understand them. And now I think they took that to be insubordination or insolence, so they started beating him. And although they have consistently been denying, in that same place, there were some cameras which captured them. And this brutality has even gone beyond the physical force, because in the circumstances, many persons having disabilities have actually been beaten. I have been involved in criminal cases where I had to go to court and stand in for persons having disabilities who were illegally detained, and in some cases, some were women who were illegally prosecuted in courts of law. And to our surprise, the magistrates were also entering pleas of guilty against these people, because when they appear in court and the charge is read to them, the first thing is, can't you plead guilty? Maybe we shall give you a lesser sentence. And then they will be just saying, yes, plea of guilty, whether they understand it or not. And now they just illegally detain them, leaving their families. So we have seen that, and we have gone to court to make applications, and many of them have been, during the complete lockdown, we went to prisons and got them back to be reunited with their families. But beyond that, we have also continuously seen how governments are lying to the world, I should say. In the specific aspect of Uganda, although there is this other international feeling that we are compliant with CRPD, we are compliant with CAT, we are compliant. But when these measures or guidelines were being put up, the government of Uganda never considered having persons with disabilities as part of the guidelines and the entire scheme. It was recently when movements started coming up that were considered. But that aside, we have seen during the lockdown, many persons having with disabilities fail to access health services, and in some of the cases, those who are pregnant were chased out from hospitals, having taken some money from some of them So these are some of the stories that we have
David,
been working on.
sorry for cutting it, but just sorry to wrap up.
Okay.
Please,
And
so we can get to the
lastly,
Q&A.
hello, Bruno.
Yeah, please continue and wrap up.
Okay. The last one that I wanted to also comment about is, for example, the children having or living with albinism, because now the communities were locked down. Maybe parents have been taking them to children's centers, but now they had to be with them. They don't know how to feed them. They don't know how to take care of these children. Even the community doesn't know. So we have seen all this happening around persons having disability, and one, to end the brutality from police or law enforcers, but number two, to make sure that we live or we walk the talk. When government puts up a show that they are compliant, they must not only be compliant in normal days, but also in abnormal situations. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for everyone's contributions. Fortunately, we won't have more time to talk about it because we would like to just give some time for our participants to ask some questions. Fortunately, we only have time for just a couple, but whoever would like to participate and ask questions to panelists, please use the raise hand option. I see one participant already has it. So, Dagnachu Wakane, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you for all the presenters for this insightful presentations. I'm Dagnacho Wakini. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Institute for Comparative and International Law at the University of Pretoria, and working on violence against persons with disabilities in Africa. And I'm a person with disability myself. So my question is to the first presenter. I texted it in the chat box as well, and that is this distinction in the definition of torture between the Human Rights Committee and the Committee Against Torture. So the involvement of public officials, as you all know, is not a necessary requirement when it comes to the ICCPR, and that I think is very important when it comes to police brutality or brutality by non-state actors against persons with disabilities. I don't have the data yet, but a good majority or a good number of cases of mistreatment, cruel and inhuman treatment against persons with disabilities are perpetrated by non-state actors just as much as they are perpetrated by state actors. So this requirement, the absence of this requirement of involvement of public officials as illustrated in the by the Human Rights Committee with regards to the ICCPR is, I think, very important. And can we say, therefore, that that is a preferable approach, that is a preferable way to address the definition of torture when it comes to persons with disabilities instead of the narrower definition provided by the Convention Against Torture? Thank you.
Thanks so much. David, would you like to answer? You're still muted, David.
Hello? Can you get me? You see, the definition of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, these are two inseparable concepts. So the link is really very thin. And you find that torture, to summarize it, torture is a severe form of inhuman treatment. You understand? But although the CAT is giving a particular kind of definition, countries have even gone out from the CAT definition to put these together. if you read the Special Rapporteur's communication to UN General Assembly in 2018, you realize that the discussion is now to domestic violence and all those, torture things that happen in private circles. So although the definition undercut is very strict with those elements, but generally speaking, when it comes to a court of law, the list is not exhaustive. So that we have seen expansive definitions, and many people are given, redress and adequate compensation.
Thank you so much, David. Does any other participant like to ask a question to panelists? Stephen, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello there. So I'm Stephen Allen. I'm co-executive director of Validity. I also want to say thank you very much on behalf of all of my colleagues and our organisation to the panellists today. I think you bring some very, very important practical insights into this critical question. I wonder, in respect of the last submission made from South Africa, what the panelists' views are in respect of the failure of police to act where there are situations of violence in the community. One of the things we have seen throughout the COVID pandemic has in fact been increased levels of public participation in enforcement of lockdown rules around social distancing, use of masks, etc. And in some cases, this has created violence. I wonder if that has happened or any of the panelists have knowledge of that, and what the panelists' views are as to when law enforcement fails to prevent acts of violence in these sorts of situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Since we're close to the time to actually finish the webinar, we're just going to ask participants for a little bit more patience, 5-10 minutes, just to address this question, and then we can just work on finalizing. So all the panelists heard the question. Who would like to take this one? Melanie, would you like to go ahead?
I think that's sure, this is Melanie. Stephen, I think that's a challenging question, I have to say, at least within the US context. Police have been very busy in the last months, actually, in many places addressing protests that are happening here in response to sort of police brutality in general against Black Americans in particular. So I think that is taking up quite a bit of resources and time. And it is particularly challenging, I think. I know of one Los Angeles Police Department personnel who Wednesdays are often a large demonstration day here in Los Angeles. And Wednesdays are often a challenging day for her. So I think protection, if on the other side sort of what police are there for, as I had mentioned earlier, to protect all citizens and to step in, I think the base of that assumption is that the police have a trust relationship with the communities that they are supposed to be protecting, and all communities that they are supposed to be protecting. So that, I think, requires a more community-based policing model in which the police know people in what's called sort of their beat or their area that they're supposed to be monitoring and be around, that they are trusted by the people in that community. And as that hasn't happened, at least here in the States, I know what persons with disabilities and activists are doing are developing their own peer communities of support. And so when there is escalation in the home and you would want someone to come and step in and support something that is happening within the home, then they call on a peer member or a community member. Maybe that's a social worker that has more training with persons with disability, or someone that has an existing relationship in that community, to be able to have, again, that trust relationship and that understanding of how to address the particular needs of the people that are involved in a particular situation.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Would anyone else would like to add anything?
Yes, in the
Please
case
go
of
ahead.
Nigeria, during our advocacy to the headquarters of the Nigerian police, the officer that actually hosted us, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, FCT, told us that they are going to carry out major reforms in order to address the attitude of police officers. And apart from that, too, she also shared some phone contacts for us to share with our members in cases of violence or perceived act of violence, so that they can, place calls to the police for immediate response, so that they can actually deal with the erring officers. Because the major problem is many of these policemen that are sent out on duties go beyond their responsibilities, and the hierarchy does not really know what is happening on the field. So by that, the hierarchy will be able to get better information as to the conduct of their men and officers on in the field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kassim. Unless anyone has any additional very quick and very brief question, just gonna give a moment. If anyone would like to raise their hand. I guess that's a no. Then on that note, I guess we can just start wrapping up the webinar. Thank you so much for everyone's participation and discussion. It was really great. It was really great to hear from all of you and hear about the extent of this issue, which is the police brutality against persons with disability during the pandemic, which results to torture. And it was very great to hear talking about the connection of police brutality with the concept of torture under the CAT Convention, and also under the ICCPR, the different approaches and the different approaches that each country takes. So it's also very interesting to hear then, the difficulty, which is also to addressing this issue, having consideration that it seems that across the globe, there's a trend that a lot of countries just haven't been giving appropriate and the necessary information to persons with disabilities, definitely not sufficient or ahead of time enough to allow them to understand the situation. It seems also police practices in a lot of countries, they just tend to be very strict and not exactly appropriate to the situation, how to engage with persons with disabilities within the COVID-19 pandemic. And we talked, and I heard from the different panelists talking about the different measures that need to be taken. On the one hand, when it comes to litigation, we talked about the issue of a dependent disability. It might be difficult to actually collect evidence or even identify the perpetrator, and there's a need to be a system of accountability in place, especially for police officers, just to make sure that a perpetrator is actually properly identified. It also be mentioned the need for a support network for persons with disabilities. So different agencies, whether it be through NGOs or public, that actually give the necessary information to persons with disability to access justice, to understand where they can make a complaint, and who to approach and bring a case and actually achieve justice. Fortunately, these are issues that are still current, and a lot of these issues are actually old issues, and there's the need for further action. And I really appreciate for all the panelists' contribution throughout this discussion and all the personal stories you were able to share. Thank you so much. On that note, then before finalizing the webinar, I'd just like to make 2 announcements. As mentioned earlier at the beginning of this webinar, so this webinar series is 1 out of 6. The second webinar is going to happen next week on the 20th of October. I just copied the link just to help you register, but the next webinar is on challenging discriminatory denial of emergency healthcare and triage policies. I highly encourage you, if you haven't already, to register and participate. And then just have one last announcement. As been mentioned, especially by Melanie, the COVID-19 DRM initiative prepared a global report about the impact of the COVID-19 related measures on persons with disabilities. The report is going to be launched officially on the 22nd of October. And we formally invite everyone to the online launch. I also pasted the link on the chat box. Hope everyone can access. Of course, we're going to continue to disseminate both on the Foundation's websites and then through our partners and the usual networks. I really hope everyone can participate and learn more about the different issues that are that persons with disabilities are currently being affected. On that note, thank you so much for coming.